Good morning, party people, and welcome to Valley of Fire State Park, just outside of Las Vegas. It's about a 45-minute drive from my house, and it's really gorgeous out here. It's a beautiful state park with lots of really well-maintained roads. It's a great place to go driving. So of course, that's exactly what I did here today. Today I brought out my 1964 Porsche 356. It's a beautiful example that was stuck in a garage in San Francisco for 30 years. A woman bought it, drove it as her daily driver in San Francisco, and then bought a convertible one day, parked this in her garage in the mid-1990s, and it sat there until she died. Her husband ended up putting it on Bring a Trailer, hadn't run in 30 years, and I bought it, went to work on the engine, replaced the tires, brakes, things like that. Now it's a wonderful driver. It goes way faster than I'm comfortable with, given the fact that it has no seat belts. One of the joys of old cars is that you don't always get the safety gear. It does have disc brakes, really nice disc brakes. It was the first year of all-around disc brakes for the 356. Later on, this line of cars morphed into the Porsche 911 that still continues today, which by the time you see this video, I should have my brand new 911 being delivered. We'll see, fingers crossed. So let's get to your questions. Top voted question comes from Mailbox, who says, "Hi Brent, I'm really enjoying your training classes. Quick question, I'm running SP Blitz Cache and on our data warehouse, and I'm receiving a priority 1 warning about Plan Cache instability. How meaningful is this warning on a data warehouse server?" Really, I think it's the same warning or same severity no matter what kind of server you have. What it's telling you, if you read the URL, is that your SQL Server has amnesia and it's not able to remember which queries have been run recently on your server. So you wouldn't want to use a Plan Cache tool if the Plan Cache is not reliable. Make sure to read that URL. I often jokingly say that URL stands for you read loser, and work on fixing that problem. I have seen people in data warehouses run free proc cache once a day because their logic is, look, yesterday's query plan should be no good today because the data has changed. I do not agree with that because a lot of your queries will be the same from day to day. Next up, we have Briggers, who asks, "Hi Brent, I've inherited an availability group with one database that has a async read-only secondary. Is there a way to help reduce the size of a redo queue?" So this is a little tricky. The first thing that I'd want to know is what version you're running. Microsoft made improvements in 2019 and then I believe again in 2022 trying to reduce redo queue pileup. It has to do with the ability to do parallel redos on the secondary, depending on what edition you're in. And if you're doing a read-only secondary, it's going to be enterprise, so you should be eligible for those. It does have to do with the ID of the database, though. The higher up the ID is, this sounds weird, you probably never looked in sys databases before. I didn't look that often before I started to hit this problem. The higher up your sys database's ID is, the less likely you are that you're getting parallel redo. So start looking into parallel redo in availability groups. That's the very first place that I'd start. It's harder to get than you would think. Next up, DoesTimeReallyExist says, "I prefer to learn SQL Server in depth instead of learning other database systems. What do you think?" What does it matter what I think? And even if it did matter, you know I sell SQL Server training classes, right? Next up, we have Aksel, who asks, "I have a duplicate index where I've got a couple of columns in index A and a couple of columns in index B. If query uses A, no memory grant occurs. If query uses index B, a memory grant occurs." This kind of question is impossible for me to answer without seeing the execution plans. That's why we invented pastetheplan.com. If you go to pastetheplan.com, it's totally free. You can, as you might guess from the clever name of the site, paste the query plan. And then that way you can ask questions on dba.stackexchange.com, stackoverflow.com, etc. And you can paste in your URL there so that other people can share your execution plan, and then they can give you those kinds of answers. Don't paste the plan in and then send me the query directly, unless, of course, you're one of my consulting clients. I don't have enough time to answer query plan questions for everybody, because, of course, that takes time for me to go pop open query plans. Next up, we have Cameo, who asks, what are your pros and cons of using local time versus UTC time for the operating system running SQL Server? What do you see more of out in the field? I see more people running local time. I wish they would run UTC. If you Google for what time zone to use on my server, there are plenty of examples out there, in-depth blog posts. I have one in a recent weekly links that talks about why you should use UTC. If I remember right, in Azure SQL DB, you still can't set times differently per database even. So you have one database that serves the West Coast, another database that serves the East Coast on the same Azure SQL DB server. You can't even change them. You have to set up separate Azure SQL DB servers. So it's real easy for Mr. Consultant Man to say just use UTC, but obviously that can have impacts if your application isn't coded to handle time zones. Your application needs to be coded to handle time zones and their rendering, which if you are subscribed to my weekly links newsletter, there's an in-depth detailed blog post from, depending on when you watch this, in the last few weeks about UTC time zones. Next up, Mailbox asks, my friend's company pays only to license 4 cores of Enterprise on a reporting server. Best I can tell, we don't need Enterprise right now. However, we might need it in the future. Is it a good idea to switch to Standard Edition, thus increasing core count, like spending the same money? I would say, what's the bottleneck on the server? What's the problem that you're trying to solve? Do you have CPU bottlenecks today? If you don't, then adding more CPUs probably isn't going to get you anything. So I don't know that I'd really do much there. It can also depend on how you bought your licensing. If you're renting your license as you go from Amazon or Azure, then you might be able to save money right away by cutting down to 4 cores of standard. But if you actually bought them, it's not like you can take them back to Microsoft and say, I'd like to switch these in. I'd like a bowl of porridge and some Standard Edition licenses. It just doesn't work that way. Which again, it just comes back to the problem you're trying to solve. Next up, ADBA asks, I'm seeing high CPU on a SQL Server VM. I've added more CPU and tuned the queries, but we still see the issues. What parameters do I need to monitor to show that it's a problem on the host side? Oh, that's a great question. If you're using VMware, it's CPU ready time. I don't remember what it is on Hyper-V. I don't even know if Hyper-V exposes that. I don't do a whole lot of Nothing wrong, nothing against Hyper-V. It's totally fine. I just don't have a whole lot of clients using it. So not that I have a whole lot of clients using VMware either. Everybody's trying to get off that sinking ship as fast as they can. But VMware CPU ready time would be the metric there. And if you Google for CPU ready time VMware, there's a bunch of blog posts describing how to monitor it too as well. Don't put SQL Server into your search terms because it doesn't have anything to do with SQL Server. You'll get not as good of results. GenXer says, you probably get this question often, but I'm getting up there in age, and how does one become a consultant? I have decades of experience with SQL Server, Windows, and networks, yet I have trouble crossing the great divide of corporate to consulting. The hardest problem by far, if you're going to try and start your own consulting company, is getting the work. If you can't open up your Rolodex, so to speak, I'm using the term Rolodex because you're old, right? You'll understand that as well as I do. If you can't open up your Rolodex, call 5 people and immediately get like 2 or 3 paying gigs because they know you, they know your track record, they know what you're capable of, they've worked with you before. If you can't immediately open up your Rolodex and get 2 or 3 first paying gigs, don't try to start your own consulting firm. Instead, go to work for another consulting firm. That way, they'll bring in the business for you, and make sure that you make that clear when you're interviewing. You know, you guys are going to be bringing in the business to me, right? You're not expecting me to bring my own business, because some slimy consultant firms will expect you to do your own sales. But then that way you don't have to worry about bringing in the business, which is by far the hard part of starting a new consulting firm. Sportsfan 101 asks, what are your thoughts on the new JSON data type in Azure SQL? I don't use it. I am a really big fan of, if you need to store files, there's a system where you put files. It's called a file system. You wouldn't put databases in a file system. You shouldn't put files in a database system. JSON files belong in file systems. People say, well, I don't want to put them in files. Yeah, whatever. I'm sure you don't want to, but you're setting money on fire by doing that in a relational database. It just doesn't make any sense. Now, in the interest of the opposing argument, Microsoft will tell you you should probably put JSON in your database. That's because they don't do a great job of shredding or processing or indexing JSON. So your CPU usage will go up. Microsoft will make more money on you due to CPU-based licensing. So of course, they want you to put JSON in the database. I do not. Next up, Bandhu says, when you're doing row versus page compression for SQL Server, do most of your clients all do row compression or page compression or some combination? Everybody I know who does compression does page. As long as you're going to do it, it's a higher compression ratio, just go page. Next up, Mailbox asks, it's a few questions for Mailbox today. In your experience, when is it time to upgrade SQL Server hardware? My friend says that they have VMs on hosts that are 8 years old. Typically in enterprises, you tend to get rid of hardware when it's no longer officially supported. Like if you can't get official support from the hardware vendor, Dell, HP, whoever, then that's when it usually goes out of support at a company and they plan to replace it, because expensive service calls tend to get really ugly. That may be less true for a virtualization host, because you just vMotion stuff off of them whenever things get ugly. But generally, it's the hardware's life of support, which tends to be 3 to 5 years. That's especially true these days due to power saving improvements in CPUs. Power saving gets better in every single rev of CPUs. And so you can end up saving money, which is important to companies as well. Juan asks a question that's loaded with passive-aggressive language. Juan says, in pure ERP environments with no user queries or tasks outside the ERP, is it safe to say that any deadlock is the responsibility of the ERP vendor to solve? Boy, this sounds like an adversarial relationship, Juan. It sounds like you're going boxing with somebody else and you're trying to say, it's not my problem. Well, let me ask you, Juan. What if you could solve them? What if you could be the one to save the day? What if you could put in a little bit of work, figure out what index or code changes need to be made, document that, share it with the end users and say, here's the change we need to get the ERP vendor to make. Let's see if we can open up a support call together with them and do it. Doesn't that sound cool? Doesn't it sound more likely to get a raise than if you just went, not my problem. I'm Juan, I'm a DBA. Think about that one. Next up, Dopinder says, what criteria do you use when evaluating stand-up desks? Once every 5 years, or whenever I have to buy a new standing desk because my office shape changes or something like that, I just go to sites that compare standing desks and I try to find the one that's the most stable. A lot of standing desks are wobbly, and when you put a wobbly monitor on top of a wobbly desk, it's going to drive you crazy, like the movement. So use as many legs as you can in the standing desk. Don't believe those two-leg vendors that you're going to be wobbling out the wazoo. Vasilis says, should I exclude my antivirus software from scanning my file stream container? What are the potential risks and benefits of doing so? Dude, I don't recommend file stream. I don't recommend any file storage inside of SQL Server. As I often say, there's a system that's designed to handle files. It's called a file system. Put your files in the file system. Those would be managed by a sysadmin. Crying in the Corner asks, Brent, you didn't update most of your mastering classes since SQL Server 22 came out. Yeah, because nobody's adopting SQL Server 22. You can see it in the adoption metrics that I put out all the time with Constant Care. People are just not using it. And two, the features that are in there, trying to find a politically correct way of saying this, they're terrible. DOP feedback is a great example. Degree of parallelism feedback, the thing doesn't work worth a damn. It doesn't solve any real pain points. So I haven't seen anything in there that you urgently need to know. Now, having said that, I am getting ready to record my Tuning T-SQL for SQL Server 2019 and 2022 presentation. It's a day-long class that I'm doing at PASS, and it will be included for everyone who has the Mastering Query Tuning class. If you have either Mastering Query Tuning or the bundles that include my mastering classes, you'll get access to that class as well. It's less about the specifics of SQL Server 2022, and it's more about what has changed in the way that we do query tuning these days, especially in the cloud. Next up, Dumb Dude asks, if you had a server that had a lot of resource contention and you were only allowed to add CPUs or memory, but not both, which one would you pick? I would generally look at the server's wait stats. If I'm bottlenecked on SOS scheduler yield, I would add CPUs. If I'm bottlenecked on page IO latch, there's a motorcycle just peeled out of here. If I'm bottlenecked on page IO latch, then I would add memory. I go into way more details on that in my mastering server tuning classes. I just realized I didn't explain the paint job of this car. I can't believe I forgot to explain that earlier, so I should explain that. So this car, it sat in this woman's garage for 30 years in San Francisco. By the time that I got it, the bodywork and paint was shot, was just totally faded. It wasn't a great paint job to begin with. The car was originally light blue. It's a sky blue for Porsche, which isn't all that far off from this. But then I wanted to get the Gulf racing livery on the car, but I wanted to do it in an unusual way. So I wrapped the car in light blue and then had a graffiti artist by the name of Dr. Ziso, Z-I-S-O, had Dr. Ziso paint the car live at a car show, did the whole 350 or do the whole racing scheme all live with spray paint. Let me tell you, I'm not an artist, and I was just like sitting there with my biting my fingernails as I was watching him live paint with brushes and spray cans on this car. That was more than a little bit terrifying. It ended up looking really well, though, really good, though. I really like how it turned out. Dopinder says, can a single DBA manage an availability group, or is a team of DBAs managed or recommended for availability group information? Dopinder, I'm going to rephrase your question. Can one DBA manage one SQL server? Well, it would depend on the DBA, and it would depend on the SQL server. I know some DBAs who I wouldn't really trust around a lawnmower. I know other DBAs who single-handedly run enterprises. So you kind of get where I'm going. It's not as simple as how many DBAs can manage one availability group. Some knives are sharper than others. Next up, Mailbox asks, what is it like to work as a DBA for a consulting firm? Is it just nonstop performance tuning fun, or are there lots of nights and weekend work? It depends on the consulting firm. Some firms, like me, I focus on performance tuning, so it's 9 to 5, so to speak. I work different hours, but performance tuning. I know plenty of other remote DBA firms who focus on production administration and troubleshooting, like making sure that your agent jobs are working, making sure your backups are working. When a job fails, they fix the job. When you have an upgrade, they do the upgrade after hours. So in large remote DBA firms, you tend to take shifts. Different people will be on call at different times. And you may even have, there are some firms that say you work, say, 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. or 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., whatever your shift is, and you're not even on call outside of those hours. You're just working with clients during those hours, managing whatever remote calls come in. So it really just depends on the size of the firm. The bigger the firm is, the more predictable your schedule's going to be. The smaller the firm is, the more unpredictable your schedule's going to be. And then let's see here, we'll do one more. Eddy asks, when I'm upgrading Azure SQL VMs from 2019 to 2022, is it okay to do in-place migration since we have snapshot backups, or should we log ship to new VM hardware? Never, ever, 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 ever do in-place upgrades. How do you test? How do you test with the users to make sure that everything is okay before you go live? Go log ship over to a new VM and test the new VM first. Make sure things are set up correctly. Configure SQL Server lockdown, configure security, lock down the way that you want. Don't deal with that old VM that everybody's had their grubby Cheeto dust fingers all in for the last few years. Go start fresh and correct your mistakes. I know you don't think you have any mistakes. I've seen your servers, and you're wrong. All right, well, it is, wow, we've had, in the span of this, however many minutes this has been, we've had little bit droplets of rain, we've had overcast, and now it's bright sun outside. Perfect timing. It's a glorious temperature, as you can tell. I mean, here I'm wearing a hoodie and jeans in Vegas, which is fairly unusual. It is 60 degrees right now, which is just glorious here. 60 degrees Fahrenheit, obviously. So I am going to go finish the rest of this drive. I'm going to drive into the Valley of Fire Visitor Center and then drive back home. It's a lovely day for a drive out and around. I'm so glad that I've finally hit the season where I can drive my cars that don't have air conditioning. That's the really glorious part, because as a classic car guy, a lot of my stuff doesn't have AC. So thanks for hanging out with me, and I will see y'all on the next office hours. Adios.